Hello, on today's ACM webinar, this webcast is part of ACM's commitment to lifelong learning and serving over 100,000 computing professionals. My name is Will Tracz. I'm the chair of ACM SIGSOFT and past chair of ACM SIGMicro, as well as past editor of ACM Software Engineering Notes. ACM offers educational and professional development resources that boost their skills and enhance career opportunities. And assuming that you can hear me, ACM recognizes the role of computing driving innovations and sustaining competitiveness in a global environment. As you can tell, this is the first time we're trying a live talking head, and there's been some last minute, as you would say, technical glitches. But regardless of whether you're a current member or a non-member, I would like you to take advantage of ACM's resources. Encourage you to join one of the 37 SIGs. Now, moving on to some housekeeping items. Before we get started, if this is your first time, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items. Today's presentation is different. It's an open and freewheeling discussion of what Peter has learned, our presenter of over 30 years being the risk moderator and creating the Risks Forum. And we are not going to be presenting slides. In reality, Peter has provided us with some links that we'll be presenting, pushing as the slides. But as it goes, this is really going to be an audience-driven presentation. I encourage you to ask questions, of which Peter will respond in real time. So please send us your questions. Send them frequently. Send them whenever you can think of them. During the presentation, you can minimize the slide area, the QA. There's all these buttons down at the bottom. You can hit Facebook or Twitter or Wikipedia in the resource list. If you need to refresh your web interface, then you know how to do it. F5 on the Windows or Command+R if you're Mac. Other than that, control your own volume, doing what you do normally, and at the end of the presentation there's going to be a survey. Kindly, if you get a chance, take a minute and fill it out. We'd like to hear from you. And as usual, we will be recording the session. It will be archived, and you'll receive a link sent to you via email as soon as it gets posted. Once again, if you're so inclined, please go to Facebook or Twitter, and you can use those widgets. If you would like to tweet some of your comments, please use hashtag #ACM Webinar Risk. Once again, that's #ACM Webinar Risk, and we'll be watching for your tweets. So, speaker introduction. And the question is, am I there? Switch to my webcam. So I'd like to introduce the speaker, if I'm still there. Introducing Peter is risky business, as I must admit I've had a hard time deciding exactly what to say that summarizes his many contributions in the fields of software engineering and security. And I'm not there. So with that, Peter, take it away.
It takes a while to cut over on this thing. Am I now being heard? Hey guys, can you hear me? Okay, great. Here we go. Thank you, Will, for your introduction. I want to thank Will enormously, because Will was the guy who took over after I had spent about 19 years at the beginning of SIGSOFT, and he took over as the editor, and now he's the chairman of SIGSOFT. And that's been a tremendous help to me, so I really appreciate not only his inviting me to do this, but to be a part of SIGSOFT for well, since 1976. It's rather an amazing effort. I want to talk a little bit about some of the experiences we've had. First of all, I'm enormously grateful to those of you who have been early subscribers to the Risks Forum, and some of you actually have been there from the very beginning in 1985. So I want to just sort of start out with a bunch of thoughts that I have. I just came back from 3 days at the IEEE Security and Privacy Symposium, where I was present actually in 1980 at the very first one. So this is the 35th meeting, and I'm the only person left who was there in 1980, who is still attending. And the essence of what's going on in security was perhaps symbolic of what we're going to be talking about today. The key thought here, coming back from 3 days of listening to talks, was that a great many of the talks were talking about vulnerabilities in one thing or another. Just about everything you can imagine, all of the web browser stuff, all of the server stuff, and a very wide variety. So over the years, the IEEE conference has had the papers on how you could hack into an automobile through the maintenance port remotely, how you could affect almost anything. The meeting yesterday closed with an hour and a half on cyber physical systems, namely electrical power and gas and rail and transportation, aviation, all of this stuff that is linked to the internet. And so we get to this notion of the Internet of Things, where there are going to be millions of URLs for just about everything you can imagine. All of the devices in your house will be linked onto the internet, and the risks that entails are quite profound. I don't think I want to get into them in horrendous detail, but you can imagine that people can be surveilling everything you do in your house through the presence of all of this information on the web. So my fundamental problem here is that there's a gigantic dichotomy between what we can do in the research community, where I've been active since, 1953, I guess, and what we can do in the real world of taking off-the-shelf software and putting stuff on it. I think one of the main lessons from the Risks Forum is that everything is vulnerable. We've had talk about nuclear power back in 85, 86, 87. We've had ongoing discussions about the risks of electronic voting, where there's basically no audit trail, there's no accountability, there's no security, there's no integrity in the system, and basically you have no assurance that your vote is going in correctly. This is kind of scary. But when you realize that everything in the electronic voting situation is a weak link, from the registration process to the voter authentication when you come up to the polls, to the actual tabulation of the votes, the casting of the votes, the counting of the votes, and the remediation after something goes horrendously wrong, where there's no way of figuring out what actually went wrong, life is kind of complicated. So on one hand, we've got the research community doing wonderful things about trying to build better systems, but now more recently doing remarkable things in basically penetrating every imaginable system, not just because the passwords are hackable and that we're still using passwords, but that the system is in some sense open to the world, even without breaking the passwords in some cases, as in the case of the internet worm. in the case of all the zombie systems that are creating spam, the unpatched pirate systems in China, for example. And you've got all of the stuff that we're living with. And now we're talking about, we're going to go to the automated highway, where you've got cars that are going to be 20 years old coexisting on the automated highway, supposedly, with automobiles that have collision avoidance systems and that can be automatically stopped by the police if they don't like what you're doing, and taking you off the road and moving you to the side where they can interrogate you or something like that. The idea of coexisting with the old cars that have never been provided with all of this automated stuff is one of the serious worries here. The idea that we're coming up with everything being computerized in situations where there's basically no system administrator possible. So if something goes wrong, you've created a sort of an automatized system where the remediation becomes very difficult. So again, in this dichotomy between what we can do in the research community and what we can do in the real world, the lessons from the Risks Forum seem to have been vastly ignored over the years. My book was 1995. If I go back and reread that, essentially every problem that existed then still exists today, 20 years later, almost 20 years later. And the remediation seems to not be as adept as it might be. Now, if we look, for example, at what's in the commercial systems, the commercial systems are very good at creating new features and new ideas and even reliability in many cases, and in some cases survivability. If something crashes, you don't lose too much. But they're not very adept in dealing with all of the security problems. So having come back from this IEEE conference, not a conference because the creators called it a symposium, and I'm very amused that the Navy decided that any meeting that had the word conference in it would be off limits for the Navy personnel at for example, the Navy Research Lab. This was a decision last year because conferences were inherently boondoggles. So this is the standard knee-jerk reaction to something, and so here I was at a symposium, which is not a conference, and lo and behold, what they're talking about almost exclusively, not quite, but almost exclusively, was all of the vulnerabilities in just about everything you could imagine. And so the lesson from the Risk Forum is that we've got to do something dramatically better. Now, from the software engineering world, where I'm wearing my ACM shirt here, let me see if I can get that on the screen. Here we go. There's an ACM SIGSOFT logo that Will sent me many years ago. The shirt I'm wearing. When we go back to that, we've been trying for, in my case, the past many years, to build systems that are much more trustworthy. And by trustworthy, I mean secure, reliable, available, survivable, interoperable in some predictable way, where there's some sense of composable predictability, where you can link two systems together or two subsystems together, and have some assurance that what's going to happen is going to be reasonable, rather than all sorts of hidden side effects that you'd never anticipated. So from a software engineering and a research point of view, we think about systems where there are carefully designed requirements, there are carefully designed specifications for the system, there is really an architecture for the overall system, and where there is perhaps some even formal methods approach that is providing assurance that the specifications are consistent with the requirements, and that the actual software is consistent with the specifications, and that the properties that you really want are going to be satisfied. Now, in the February issue of the Communications, we had an article by Nancy Levison and her colleague on how some of the stuff she's been doing for safety can be applied to security. This is still in the process of being demonstrated through experimentation and real-life system exploration. But it's an example of how a sort of a radically different way of thinking about things might suitably change a lot of the thinking about how do you build secure systems. I'm also involved with the folks at the University of Cambridge, SRI jointly with Cambridge, in designing new hardware, new software, new programming language variants that ideally will be much more secure, trustworthy, reliable, whatever, in the research community. And there's always the question of how do you get that into the real world, but that's not something I want to get into today. I just want to say that in the research community, we seem to have lots of would-be approaches to how to make systems that are much more trustworthy. Whereas in the real world, we seem to be sliding down the razor blade of life, as Tom Lehrer once said. The notion that basically everything we're building is riddled with security flaws. In many cases, it falls apart on its own. It doesn't even need hackers and crackers and smackers and snackers and whatever else you might want to contemplate. Power failures and software errors and hardware failures, all of these things have to be taken into account. Plus the fact that all of the people involved are not behaving absolutely perfectly. So when you start to think about insider misuse, for example, you discover that a lot of the problems that we've been ignoring for years are insider misuse problems. This comes up particularly in the electronic voting world. I can go on at great length there, but I see that there are numerous myths that have been created. And one of the lessons, I think, from the Risk Forum is that you've got to shoot down these myths. So we have the notion at the moment that big data is a wonderful thing. Big data is also a very problematical thing when it comes to privacy and security and reliability and availability and interoperability and so on. We have the notion that if you put everything in the clouds, everything will be wonderful and you'll save tons of money. The cloud stuff thus far has very little real trustworthiness in it. You might say, well, you can encrypt everything and put it out in the cloud, and you can use homomorphic encryption or something like that so that the cloud doesn't have any decryption going on and it never sees the unencrypted information. But there are still enormous problems that arise. So the concept of trusting cloud computing, especially when it's an untrustworthy third party that you don't even know who the hell it is, that concept is one that I think is fraught with security problems. You have to excuse me. I'm fighting off having been in severe air conditioning for the past 3 days in this non-conference, sorry. And so I'm just going to be a little hoarse here. Now, the other myth that I need to introduce here, and then we'll get into the discussions a bit later, is the notion of the Internet of Things. And the Internet of Things is this concept that everything is going to be online, and we won't have to worry about everything because everything's going to be seamlessly secure and seamlessly reliable, and it's just a matter of small matter of programming or design or whatever to make everything seamlessly wonderful. Now, one of the questions that's just come in is, how has the nature of risks changed over the years? As I said in my book in 1995, I listed all these risks of security, reliability, safety, and privacy, and much more. If I go back and look at everything there, I sort of noted in passing that a lot of the problems that were there 20 or 30 years ago are still recurring in one form or another, maybe in a slightly different form. A lot of the problems that were present in the internet worm in 1988 are still around. We still have the .r host problem. We still have the buffer overflow problem. We still have the encrypted password file being unprotected in some cases and subject to dictionary attacks externally. The concept of buffer overflow is, again, sort of in the research community. We had a pretty good solution to that on the stacks of Multics back in 1965. And yet we see buffer overflows as being, in the past 10 years or so, one of the predominant ways of breaking into systems and gaining root access and being able to do pretty much anything. We have the notion that all of a sudden we're going to have very, very powerful smart mobile devices that can do everything, including accepting speech inputs. There's always the problem that somebody walking behind you says in a loud voice, RM star, and you're suddenly blown out of all your files in your Unix system. There are a lot of authentication problems. We believe in passwords. We still believe in passwords. 30, 40 years later, we're still dependent on passwords. There are lots of other ways of doing it. They all have vulnerabilities. Again, at the symposium, the IEEE symposium this week, there were several papers on how to break password stuff in new and delicious ways, all of which suggest that the remediation that was proposed is probably the wrong solution to the wrong problem. Somehow along the way, we've got to get rid of fixed reusable passwords. So the nature of risks over the years is really remarkably not moving as rapidly as it should. I think the fundamental fact that everything is still riddled with flaws, whether they're security, reliability, or whatever, suggests that the risks are still there and they're not going away. And in fact, in some ways, things are getting worse. Whereas at the same time, we are relying more and more and more on computers that are not trustworthy. And particularly in the notion of the clouds and big data and things like that, where you've got tremendous amounts of information all coalesced in the same place. Now, what programming languages would be good combinations of safety and runtime efficiency? I've recently stoked up a little private discussion within SRI and my folks in Cambridge, contemplating something that relates to that problem. We've been through hundreds of programming languages over the last many, many years. We've had languages that attempted to avoid many of the problems that we've been making. We've added all of the typed languages and things of that nature, and some of the functional languages that have very limited side effects. And so the question I proposed was sort of related to what we're doing in our DARPA project at the moment, jointly with SRI and Cambridge. If you were to start all over again, what would you do differently? And I think this is a question that everybody needs to be asking once in a while. Every 10, 15 years or so, it might be worth looking at that. I've been through, I think this is my third clean slate architecture effort. And applying that to the programming language question, would it be worth considering trying to develop a programming language in which it was virtually impossible to write things that were not secure, that there were no buffer overflows, that there were basically no side effects, no nasty things going on. Now, for very many different types of use, I think you'd need the reality to strike. We've had programming languages that attempted to do that. I remember when Lee Gong and I ran a workshop at SRI on programming for mobile devices. This was 15, 17, 18 years ago. I don't know, long ago. And the Sun guys had created Java at that point. And Gosling came in and he said, you know, we've designed Java in such a way that you can't write insecure code. Some of you will chuckle at that. There's seriously a problem there. But I think the question is that if all of the programming languages we have today are so vulnerable to writing bad code, can we develop a new programming language, at least for certain critical functions like designing operating systems, for example, or building appware, in which you just cannot do a lot of bad things? And the answer is probably no, unless you have new software and new operating systems to go along with it. And this brings me to one of my key lessons from all of the risks work, and that is that you have to look at everything holistically. If you're just thinking about what can we do to improve a password mechanism, or what can we do to check whether a given password is good or not, then we're missing the boat. We're trying to solve a point problem with a point solution and totally ignoring the fact that the overall problem is one that involves hardware, software, programming languages, and all of the people involved, some of whom are well-intentioned but not perfect in their behavior, some of whom are malicious and are trying to capture things or take advantage of your system, especially for financial gain. So when we started all the Risks Forum back in '85, we listed all kinds of problems that exist and that needed to be addressed. And if I go back and look at that very first issue in August 1st of 1985, all of those problems are still open in the sense that they have not been adequately resolved. A question came in, what are the theoretical limits? How secure, reliable can we be? Is proving security equivalent to the halting problem? Well, great question. There's no such thing as perfect security. There's no such thing as perfect reliability. Butler Lampson wrote a paper years ago which pointed out in terms of hardware development, if the system is not secure, it's not going to be reliable. And if it's not reliable, it's not going to be secure. Now, you can extend that to safety and many other properties. All of those are emergent properties of the entire system, and you cannot reason about them in the small. Furthermore, we do not have a theory of composability that would allow us, in general, to be able to derive properties of the overall system, the top-level emergent properties, from the hardware properties, from the software properties, from the programming.
Okay, I don't know why we've lost sound for Peter here. Peter, hopefully he's refreshing his system. I will, assuming that you can hear me, take over with my introduction that I cut short to say that there once was a fellow named Peter. His columns on risks couldn't be neater. His awards are many, and his papers are plenty, and his puns couldn't be sweeter. And with that, till we get back, take a look at Peter's bio and maybe click on some of those links. So with that, I'll switch back over to the system feed, and hopefully Peter will cut in. Okay, this is Will. I'm just back. I just wanted to thank all you people who are out there listening and sending in all the good questions. Yes, I have about 100 people reminding me that you've lost your audio. And some of the questions I thought I'd read until I get Peter back online here is... this is really interesting technology that we're using here. First time is a charm. And I'll switch you back to music. Once again, I thank you for this, your patience here and your continued questions. I'm sure Peter will get around to addressing the ones that you sent in the time that we have available, as well as getting back to you and posting these questions online. Okay, take it, Peter, when you see you back. Okay, well, Peter is logging in and logging out. It occurred to me while we are killing time that I wonder if somebody hacked into this video system and, as a joke, sort of crashed us during mid-presentation. So I have no good answers here. I just ask your continued patience while we...
Okay, am I back? Hello? Am I back yet? Yes, good. Okay, listen, chalk that one up to Comcast. My phone line died, my television died, everything went bloop. And this reminds me of when I was teaching a course on survivability in Maryland. And I was talking about the Wallops Island missile launch platform, where they were trying to study the effects of lightning on the missile launch and what would happen to the controls of the missile. And while I was talking about that, lightning struck the conference room in which I was, or the lecture room from which I was projecting to an outfeed to various other non-remote, remote viewers. And the kids were all saying, well, how the hell did you do that? I mean, that was kind of funny. At any rate, that was Comcast, and thank you, Comcast, for your wonderful service. There's a great risk of putting all your eggs in one basket. And the bottom line there is we've had over and over, we had the case way back in the 70s where a single line got cut by a backhoe, and it took out a great deal of telecommunications. We had the case where the ARPANET between the connection between New York and Boston, they had 7 different high-speed phone lines, all of which went through the same conduit, which was cut by a backhoe. So we have the problem of the single weak link, or in fact now we're getting to the case where we have multiple weak links, where we put in all sorts of redundancy, and we believe in things like least privilege and all the good software engineering concepts, and yet we find that an attacker can break through one thing and then become an insider, and all of a sudden he's got you. So let me try to do more questions at this point. It looks like I'm starting over from the team chat because I've lost all of the original messages, and I couldn't hear Will when he was talking about what he had in the way of questions. The bottom line here is that you've got to think big. You've got to think about the whole system. And as we go to the Internet of Things or the use of cloud computing with untrustworthy third parties and untrustworthy fourth parties and so on, and of course the government trying to access everything for surveillance purposes, you've got to look at the whole system and figure out what's going on. Now, this gets to be increasingly complicated. Getting back to the question of what's changed between then and now, the attacks have become much more significant, much more subtle. You've got things like the differential power analysis that was able to break most of the European smart cards. Let me just read what Will has written. I've got a ton of questions here. Let's see. Let's see if we can bring back. Automotive safety is legislated with hefty fines following litigation. Should data privacy be similarly mandated? Yeah, you've got huge lobbies trying to make sure that doesn't happen. If necessary to ensure trust, how can these be demonstrated? Very difficult, I think, in general. The question of regulation and liability, for example, is a very, very difficult one, especially in the world where the shrink wrap says, do not use this in critical applications. We have the Yorktown missile cruiser divide by zero problem, which had the actual engine controls of the ship in line with the Windows system, the shrink wrap of which says don't use this in critical applications. Divide by zero killed the operating system in an application, actually, and killed the engine control. So, yeah, I should read the questions more carefully, says Jan, and I will try to do that. So I think let's try to do more questions. But I think you've got the message here, which is that we're at the tip of an iceberg, and we keep trying to solve the problems that relate to the top 5% or 3% or 2% of what's visible, ignoring the fact that 95% of the iceberg is down there, and nobody has a clue as to what's entailed. I think I'm very optimistic from the research point of view. I'm very pessimistic from the real-world problems in thinking that we're not converging, we're actually diverging. And so the average person here says, oh yeah, I trust my cell phone, I trust my computer, I trust my toaster to do the right thing, but my toaster is going to be connected to the internet, and if I have something in there that's flammable and I can remotely turn on the toaster, then maybe I've got a serious problem. That's an oversimplified example. There's a question here. Speaking of Comcast, do you have any comments on risks and net neutrality? This is a real pigsty. It's not a technical issue, it's a social issue. And I think in the Risks Forum, we've covered that one at great length. If you believe in a level playing field, then you believe in net neutrality. If you believe in the power of Comcast and AT&T and everybody else who's in that business to do the right thing from the consumer point of view, you're probably living in a fantasy world. So I think that's a problem. Will asks, can we identify an area in which security technology has achieved major real-world success? I would say cryptography has really come out of the closet, and there's some fascinating stuff. The practicality of homomorphic encryption, where you don't need to decrypt it, but you can do operations on it. The multi-party cryptography is theoretically beautiful. There are lots of problems with practicality, but from a theoretical point of view, the cryptography work is gorgeous. From the notion of formal methods, I think we've come a very long way, and the fact that we're trying to use them again in a very serious way relating to hardware design is symptomatic of some of the things where we believe we can design and implement something that is much more trustworthy than generally available. The real-world successes are a little bit awkward, because most of the successes are ignoring security. So the question that Will has posted to me is, what are the major security successes? And I'm reluctant to say that we have really progressed. We certainly haven't progressed much in authentication in the real world. We haven't progressed much in auditing and accountability and trustworthiness and integrity in voting machines. Although, again, in the research community, there's some beautiful work there. So the challenge is, once again, how do we link that together? There's a question on will there be a terrorist attack on the U.S. that could legitimately be characterized as a cyber Pearl Harbor? We've had a bunch of them in the small, and we tend to do palliative things. Congress will pass a law making it illegal to hack or whatever. But from a practical point of view, if the systems are seriously vulnerable, we've got a huge problem. You can look at the Iranian centrifuge problem as something that could have happened to us. We might want to believe that we're more isolated from the rest of the world because our security is so good. I think events of the past couple of years have demonstrated that that's simply not true. another question, even with formal validation, how do we know that there aren't backdoors in our hardware? There are always going to be backdoors. Everything we're doing at the moment in our joint work with Cambridge is open source. And a malicious nation or agency or whatever can take that and put backdoors in it. Now, with the formal verification, you might be able to demonstrate the source code or the hardware specifications have not been altered, but you can still patch things in the implementation. So you still need the ability to prove that the implementation is consistent with the specification. That's still a long ways off for real systems, whereas proving that specs are consistent with requirements is a lot easier. But there's no such thing as a complete, perfect proof of anything in exactly the same way as there's no proof, there's no successful way of building a system that is completely secure against all possible attackers. You've got insider misuse to worry about, you've got denial of service attacks, where they don't even have to break into the system, but can disable the system in some remote way without ever accessing anything internally. Is risk somehow related to complexity? That's a very good issue. I think complexity is probably the biggest problem we've got. We've got operating systems that are 50 million lines of code. We've got applications that are hundreds and hundreds of millions of lines of code. And we basically have no idea of understanding what's going on in there. Getting back to my notion of maybe we could have a programming language that prevents you from doing a lot of that. The wonderful new stuff in software-defined networking and OpenFlow for reconfiguring networks on the fly is also something that in the research community looks very interesting. Making that practical from a security point of view is still a long ways off, but it's something that's worth pursuing. On the other end, there's always going to be denial of service attacks that trick the system into doing something that reconfigures it in such a way that the attacker has gained an advantage. And the idea that we can ever anticipate all possible failure modes and all possible attack modes seems to me to be rather ludicrous. So the idea of distributed systems is one that by itself is extremely difficult. We have the fundamental problem that despite all of the theory, Les Lamport in his recent Turing Award is somebody who's been a pioneer in that for years. Despite all the theory, you don't see systems built that way, and the idea of distributed programming is still one that is a long way off. There's some serious software engineering problems that need to be resolved. There's programming language problems that need to be resolved. I'm running out of time, and I'm sorry for Comcast's wonderful interruption of the smoothness of this presentation. The webinar itself had all kinds of glitches that we were able to take care of, so I'm glad that that has pretty much worked. Didn't work quite as seamlessly as we wanted. But let me try to get back to Will. I think he can come on live and make a few remarks. My fundamental contention here is that we have to look at the problems holistically. We have to address trustworthiness that encompasses security, reliability, availability, interoperability, predictable composability, and a whole bunch of other things. And when we try to solve things with point solutions to what appear to be point problems, we are completely missing the ballgame. And that's probably the biggest lesson from the Risks Forum. that if you're dealing with complexity, you've got to have some kind of predictable composability so that you can actually derive the properties of the composite system without fear that it's going to be devastating. So sorry about the complexity, the complications here. I'm getting a little hoarse, but let's switch back over to Will.
Well, Peter, and if my webcam cooperates, would like to thank all those in attendance. We only lost about 10% during the our awkward disruption. I'd like to thank Peter for his informative presentation today and his willingness to put up with our technology glitches, as well as providing some valuable insights into security and our future that I know we all have vested interest in. So this webinar was recorded. It'll be available online in a few days at learning.acm.org/webinar. And you'll find announcements of upcoming webinars. We're having one on Hadoop coming up in June, I believe. Big data and other ACM activities at learning.acm.org and acm.org. So as we go to the survey now, if you have time, please, we'd appreciate your feedback. The survey will be coming up on the screen, and you can suggest future topics and speakers. So this is Will Tracz saying goodbye for now, and take care. Thanks for joining us.